I've worked with a lot of clients where we've sort of come in the middle of a decarbonization plan, but we actually evaluated their decarbonization plans and realized that their baseline was incorrectly calculated. You certainly don't need to get it verified to start a decarbonization plan, but have somebody review it because, like I said, it costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of time. You certainly don't want to be put in that position where you have to backtrack.
That's Dr. Albert Chung, Principal Engineer at GSI Environmental, a scientist, verifier, and decarbonization advisor who spent more than 15 years on the other side of greenhouse gas inventories, reviewing the work that companies submit for third party verification. In this conversation, we get into what verifiers actually look for when they first open up a GHG inventory, the red flags that signal trouble before the audit even begins. We talk about inventory management plans, why companies write them at the end when they should build them from day one, and what it means to create documentation that survives staff turnover. We dig into materiality thresholds, the spend based methodology trap, and why starting in Excel might actually be the right foundation, even for large organizations. Welcome to the Carbon Management and Accounting Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Stainthorpe. This podcast is brought to you by Northstar Carbon and Impact, the carbon and sustainability management platform built by sustainability professionals for sustainability professionals. Northstar helps companies simplify GHG accounting, improve data quality, and stay audit ready across scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions so teams can spend less time reporting and more time driving real impact. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Albert Chung, Principal Engineer at GSI Environmental. I've had the pleasure of working with Albert for the last 4 years, and his experience as a verifier over 15 years has given him incredible insight into what actually works when building strong inventories. Beyond verification, he helps companies develop decarbonization plans that are technically sound and actually implementable. If you've ever wondered what separates inventories that sail through verification from those that struggle, or how to build systems that will hold up when your team changes, this conversation delivers practical answers from someone who's seen it all. Let's dive in. Albert, thanks so much for joining me today. I've learned a ton working with you over the years, and I'm really excited to share some of your insights with our audience here today.
Well, thanks, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the time that we spent together. I'm really honored that I'm on the podcast.
Great. Well, I think for people that don't know, you've been doing greenhouse gas verification for over 15 years. And it may seem like a strange place to start, but I actually wanted to start by asking you about, in all of that experience, when you've opened up a greenhouse gas inventory to do a verification and immediately thought, oh, this is going to be challenging, where you saw red flags right off the bat. And I wanted to start with that to just see a memorable story and see if in those specific instances, you actually think there's some takeaways that we can all learn from what doesn't work to make sure that we don't repeat that.
No, I'd be happy to, and I'm not going to call out specific clients, but I think oftentimes when you go through the initial screening process or the initial questionnaires, and some people on the staff ask, "Well, can you tell me where I can get specific emission factors?" And that's a red flag. I think a common basic misunderstanding of calculation procedures is certainly a red flag. There's a lot of trainings out there, a lot of guidance documents out there that could really direct you to the right spot. So anytime that comes up in a screening questionnaire of an audit, that's certainly a red flag. I think a lot of turnover, turnover happens. There's a lot of jobs out there. People, change from job to job. So I do understand there's a lot of turnover. And the problem with that is that each person may do it differently. So I think in going through those questionnaires, understanding that there is a lot of turnover that might cause a little concern on my end. There's also a lot of transition and processes. I think I'm sure we'll talk a lot about it in this podcast, but 6 years ago, majority of the audits I were doing, people were using Excel. Now it's very rare. Most people are using some sort of software solution. So if you sort of are working with a company where their disclosure transitioned from Excel to software, from software maybe back to Excel, or maybe transition from software to software to software, I think those platforms, those differences in how calculations are done certainly can be a red flag. I know I'm going to say this a lot. but documentation of a clear, repeatable process that really tells a story of how the data is collected, the data is aggregated, and how the data is used in the calculations. I think if a company does not have that in place, I think that could be certainly cause for issues. Oftentimes, the limitation of software is, they call it a black box, but there are certainly some good softwares out there that have good audit functions that really tell the story that's really very transparent in the path of how they aggregate the data, what emission factors they use. They actually provide specific links to the guidance documents that refer to that as specific emission factors. So while some softwares out there that might be a black box, there's certainly quite a number of softwares out there that really do have very nice audit features. So, again, I think it comes down to documentation and just really having turnover not only in staff, but the platform that companies are using that certainly can lend itself to, having some lift.
That rings true to me. But the question about emission factors, I think, is that one where you sometimes see people get confused about the role of a verifier versus a consultant. And when they ask about emission factors, maybe it means that they don't have their inventory really ready to move into verification.
Correct, correct. I think, a lot of people misunderestimate the complexity of maybe even doing a scope one and scope two greenhouse gas emissions inventory. It can get complicated, and there's certainly a place for companies to rely on consultants who are very knowledgeable in which manufacturers to use and which emission factors don't apply. As sustainability reporting becomes more and more regulated, there's going to be a lot of companies that think they can just do it themselves internally, and they very well may. But I think now that it is becoming more of a compliance exercise as opposed to a voluntary exercise. I think a lot of companies, even companies that are very big name companies, are going to rely on internal staff to sort of give it a try for the first couple of years. And I think if assurance is required, it's fortunate that there is a limited assurance progression from going from a limited to reasonable assurance. But I think those questions are going to come up a lot now that sustainability reporting is trending on the side of being required.
I was just curious whether it's spreadsheets or software, you're probably seeing a wide range of approaches. As a verifier, if you were designing a system, is there anything you would do just from the get go to think about? Here's a good way to have documentation that leads to transparency, that makes it easier for someone else to follow, and probably also helps when you are having a staff transition for someone else to be able to understand kind of what went into it.
Yeah, I think I see a lot of times companies wait to do an inventory management plan update or refresh at the end, or even create one at the end. I certainly endorse doing it from the get go. You want to create a narrative that doesn't require a lot of annual updates. However, you want it to be detailed enough so that it's actually accurate, that somebody, whether it's you or a colleague, can follow it from step one all the way to the final step. So even though maybe you've been doing it for 3 or 5 years, and you think you're familiar with it, certainly still rely on that management plan, because there will be sections that you'd be like, "Wow, this section needs updating because this is maybe how we did it next year, but this is how we are doing it this year." It's not a document that just happens at the end. And oftentimes when you're done with the disclosure, you're trying to rush to meet a deadline, and you sort of forget things and you sort of do some shortcuts. But I know the schedules are tight. Staffing is tight, but do your best to sort of adhere to that management plan while you're doing the preparation, because like I said, it'll either validate your existing management plan or it'll highlight sections that need to be updated.
And in terms of best practice, do you see companies treating their inventory management plan as kind of an evergreen document where they have something, the structure, the basic foundations remaining the same, but they're making updates year over year?
Sure, I've seen some management plans that could be, close to 100 pages, and
Wow.
actually calls out specific people, specific department, and those people leave. And, those can be a headache. Like I said, simple is the best. I'm a big fan of process flow diagrams. I'm a big fan of figures. Narratives can get a little wordy, and you can sort of get lost in the weeds a bit with words. I'm a big fan of figures, process flow diagrams to sort of indicate, what department came from the data and, what we did with it, and maybe have little flags for each process flow diagram saying what's happening in that little box and what reference guidance documents you use in that box. So I'm certainly a fan of simple, but also accurate enough to where it is reflective of how you're preparing your disclosure.
I love thinking about that visual element and how diagrams can help clarify. And I wanted to then use that to transition to talking about scope 3 data. Thinking about that flow diagram or that way of organizing data, is there any advice that you would offer to companies when they think about their approach to data collection or methodology? And I was hoping to even talk about the trade off between spend based versus activity based, primary data versus industry averages. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of wisdom to share about methodologies and frameworks that you think have worked well.
There's always going to be assumptions, regardless if it's greenhouse gas emission calculations or any type of calculations. There's always going to be assumptions. I think the important thing for companies is to understand is the material impact of the assumptions that they have to make because of a lack of data. There's a lot of guidance documents out there that really tell you what assumptions to use, but how significant is relying on that assumption in your total scope 3 category 1. If it's a minor impact, then maybe you really don't need initiatives to collect data for that piece of information in the future. But if it is a material impact to your emissions by making assumptions, then oftentimes you're not going to have that data the first year, but you could at least put a roadmap in place so that maybe by year 2, year 3, you're starting to collect that data. At least it gives you that year 1 idea of, wow, our missions based off of assumptions from best practice are really large for this one emission source. We really need to make an effort to collect data to really understand its impact. Again, assumptions are fine. It's always going to happen. But I think understanding the material impact of that assumptions and really going through that cost benefit analysis of, is it worth, initiating a program to get more data for something it might not be significant, but you're going to have to start somewhere. And oftentimes companies start with assumptions.
Can I ask, just diving a little deeper on what's material and not material? In some of the past work that I've done, usually we've used a percent number. So we've said things that are under 1%, we're going to consider not material. And I think some of the reason I ask that is just from personal experience. Collecting the data and putting it into the inventory is often like a 6-month process for some of these larger companies. And so I was just curious, what's the resources that sustainability teams should be thinking about allocating to different things? And is there any reference that you'd give about how to think about what's material or what's not material?
Sure. So yeah, I totally understand that resources are tight for company. It might be a small sustainability group that really is leading the charge for these really company-wide, sustainability initiative. It's really difficult to chase every material impact. But I think the ones that are maybe relevant to your industry, say if you're in food and beverage, and if a material assumption related to an emission factor related to how much wheat you are purchasing. Maybe that's something that's significant. I think really understanding your business operations and really understanding your resources and the cost of time, because there is a compliance aspect to some of this, whether it's not you're complying with a specific regulatory requirement or you have science-based targets or disclosing to a program that has certain requirements. You do have the cost of time. I think it's really understanding what you can attack, what you can bite off and chew, and going that route. But typically, from a verifier component perspective, material impacts are anything that results in more than 5% discrepancy of a statement. So whether it's the emission factor or the actual data or the combination of the two, typically if it's greater than 5%, that's when we ask the companies sort of dig into things a little further and see if we could resolve that so that it's not a impact that results in more than 5%. It's for that specific scope or that category.
No, that makes a lot of sense. The question I really wanted to ask is if you had any thoughts for sustainability practitioners about how to future proof their inventory. It's always hard to be prepared for what you don't know. And we don't know exactly how different guidance is going to evolve, where there's going to be required reporting versus voluntary. But I imagine that there's probably some principles, which maybe goes back to the transparency and documentation, that helps make the inventory more adaptable in the future, just knowing that this is going to continue to be an evolving space. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about how to think about future proofing your inventory, just knowing things will continue to change.
Yeah, no, things will always change. Again, whether it's staff turnover or the platform that you use or, the greenhouse gas protocol updating their procedures, but things are always going to change. But I think really understanding the limitations of your company's data collection processes is really going to be important because there might be reasons why you're just simply not going to be able to get good data for a certain region. It just might be limitations of maybe people power in that region, but understanding the limitations of the company that you work for and how they collect data in certain regions of the world. Some regions are more mature than others. In an ideal world, all business divisions and all business regions will have similar processes and how they collect data and how they aggregate data and how they deliver you the data. That's not reality. So I think having a clear understanding of the limitations of some parts of your business and conveying that in the event that you do get audited, conveying that limitation to your consultant or your verifier and having them assess that and make sure that is it material? Is this something based off of the interviews? Is this something that you can improve on, or is it just a lack of resources? But I think really understanding for the company that you work for, the pluses and minuses of how they collect the data can really future proof their specific greenhouse gas inventory.
That's really helpful to think about. And so it feels like the more you can document where there's limitations, that's going to be really helpful for knowing some of the unknowns or the challenging spots in advance.
It really is. It really is. And again, I think this really endorses the process of doing that plan from the get go, from the start. Don't wait till the end. Maybe flagging areas or sections, providing, this is something you don't necessarily need to disclose, but an internal risk matrix on, this area of the world is very difficult to get data. We're doing our best, but at least letting the people know who are preparing it that, this is just a limitation of how we collect data. So, because like I said, every different parts of the world are different. Different parts of the business are different, and they all do things their own way, unfortunately. But I think documenting that and having that realization that that might be reality really will go a long way in how you disclose and prepare your inventory, and as well as how you sort of respond to auditors' questions during the audit.
Albert, we really haven't talked about this much before, but I believe you've also done work not just on verification, but also helping with decarbonization plans. And this is something that's I'm very passionate about, but it's interesting thinking about usually a greenhouse gas inventory is looking backwards, right? It's looking at kind of a snapshot of the organization. Oftentimes, I've found just with the time it takes to get data, you're looking 6 months back, a year back, sometimes even a little further. Versus decarbonization, you're trying to forecast forward the opportunities that you can do to reduce emissions. And ideally, those things should be as linked as possible, that the greenhouse gas accounting should inform decarbonization plans. But I was just wanted to ask if you can speak to any of the decarbonization work that you've done and how you see the linkage between doing good climate accounting and then that leading to decarbonization plans and then decarbonization implementation.
Yeah, decarbonization can potentially cost a lot of money. It's very valuable and it's very important, but it can be very costly. So I've worked with a lot of clients where we've sort of come in the middle of a decarbonization plan and they're starting with a baseline that I mean, I wouldn't even say it needs to be audited, but reviewed by a third party because, maybe they've just been doing it the way they've been doing it, or the consultant that has been doing it the way they've been doing it, and they do it the same way. But we actually evaluated their decarbonization plans and realized that their baseline was incorrectly calculated, and there were some misconceptions of assumptions and misunderstandings of how data can be used. You certainly don't need to get it verified to start a decarbonization plan, but have somebody review it because, like I said, it costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of time, it costs a lot of company buy-in that you have to get resources and a lot of different departments to really get on the same train, and for you to go back to them after you initiate some decarbonization strategies and say, well, we aren't really seeing the levels of reductions that we were anticipating because we found out later that our baseline was miscalculated. So I think that's very important. You certainly don't want to be put in that position where you have to backtrack. I certainly would highlight the emission sources that are not only significantly impacting your emissions inventory, but also the ones where you have what I call actionable data, because you're going to use data to create the calculations, but how can greenhouse gas reduction initiatives be reflected in the data that you're using? So, for example, we're doing an initiative, but whenever we incorporate that into our calculations, the source data that we're using doesn't account for that type of adjustment of emission reductions. I'm not sure if that's coming across, but you just definitely want to use actionable data, you know, a significant emission source that is using data that you'll actually see whenever you initiate those emission reductions, that source data will also be reduced.
I think one example that I think speaks to that is when you're using kind of general spend based emissions factor data. The best way to reduce that is to spend less money. And for a lot of companies, there's definitely times that that can be implemented, but oftentimes that might be core to the business. You can't necessarily stop spending money. Really, what you would actually want to do is switch to suppliers or processes that have a lower carbon impact. But if the data itself is spend based, you might not have the granularity or the visibility for that to translate into a decarbonization reduction.
Yeah, 100%. So, for example, if you're a metal manufacturer and a big component of the metal that you source is aluminum, and you're relying on a decarbonization baseline that is spend based, well, how are you going to reduce your emissions for, if one of your initiatives is scope three, category one emission reduction? But, you are going to want to highlight some of those key raw materials that you purchase, such as aluminum or steel, and then possibly do a process based, maybe do some life cycle analysis to really understand, are we sourcing it from a low carbon, aluminum source or a low carbon steel source? But if, like you were saying, Aaron, if you are relying on that baseline that is a spend based approach, you certainly won't see emission reduction by implementing a green steel because sometimes that might be more expensive. And so you're going to start integrating this low carbon raw materials that potentially might be more expensive. If your calculations are based off of that spend based approach, you certainly won't see that, emission reduction.
I wanted to ask how you see corporate carbon accounting evolving. Do you think companies are getting better at this? Where do you think the profession's headed? And some of this is similar to the future proofing, but just what advice would you give based off the evolution you've seen so far and what you think might be coming just in the next 5 years?
Yeah, again, I think I mentioned this a little bit, but I think the integration of software is going to be big moving forward. Like I said, inventories that we were auditing several years ago were highly Excel based, and now almost every company is using software. I sort of draw a comparison to financial statement reporting. Pretty much everyone uses software, and I certainly think that as this becomes more and more of a regulated process, companies are going to rely on software more and more. Especially it's these large companies that are going to be regulated. The small companies where you can do it in Excel, I think they'll be fine in Excel. But as these regulations hit, the larger companies are going to rely on software solutions to help them with their compliance. Having an understanding all the different softwares out there is going to be very important because there certainly are a lot of software, good and bad out there that helps companies prepare their greenhouse gas emissions inventory. But I think, certainly being fluent in what software is out there, how transparent they are, like I said, companies are very hesitant to implement any sort of black box software. So something that has a very good audit trail, especially if scope three emissions are going to be required. I think people, we have a lot of clients that realize, well, right now we're only being asked to do scope one and two, even though we're a large company, I think Excel can sort of manage that, but they themselves are like, well, if scope three is going to become regulated and required, we're certainly going to have to sort of open our mind to software solutions. So I think that's sort of where the industry is headed towards. And I think it's a really good opportunity for a lot of people to understand the software and, to be users of the software and to sort of partner with software companies to really make sure that that transition for companies using software goes smoothly.
I think this might be piggybacking off of your answer, but I was going to ask if there's anyone listening who's either with a company or working with a client that wants to do their first comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory. They haven't really done it before. Is there advice that you would give them about where to invest upfront in building out their greenhouse gas accounting system?
Even though I've talked about software, I think getting started doing it in Excel is always the best way because you understand your limitations. You understand the gray zones and the calculation processes in your data. And then when you transition to software, at least you have that foundational understanding of how the calculations work and where the limitations of your data comes from. So start small. Start with scope one and two. I think everybody wants to jump into scope three because that's sort of the more exciting emissions you really get an understanding of the straight line process of how, you get the data, you aggregate the data, you sort of match it with the emission factor, you do some conversions, and you convert it to greenhouse gas emissions. Well, start with your scope one and scope two, but then start, maybe start sprinkling in some scope three. But I think, there's a lot of good trainings out there, a lot of good guidance out there that, a lot of people who are really getting into this industry can really rely on. Yeah, I think, creating an Excel workbook, very simple Excel workbook with the guidance documents out there. And again, focusing on scope one and two, because that's really the way that you really understand a lot of this calculation. There's a lot of uncertainty in here, or there's a lot of uncertainty in how this data works, as opposed to companies that are just going to jump into a software solution that may not ever know that there's these vague areas because they just think the software solution is the right answer. So certainly getting started in Excel, I highly encourage. And for companies looking to eventually having to disclose emissions, get started in Excel. And again, see if that works, that's great. But at least it will give you the understanding of the limitations and the uncertainty that is inherent when you're doing some of these calculations.
I think that really helps. And thinking about kind of the advice that people might follow very much depends on where they are in their journey. Right. So I think that that really helps. Albert, now we're going to move into the implementation minute. And I wanted to ask, let's say that it's Monday morning. Someone just finished listening to this episode on their commute to work. What's one thing they should do when they get to their desk, something that'll take about 30 minutes that you think would help them improve their inventory management and their approach to carbon accounting?
I would say make sure that you understand it's a journey. No one's going to get it right the first swing. This is going to, there's companies out there that have been doing this for many, many years and are still improving on a year to year basis. So don't think that you have to get it right your first year or even your second. Document your limitations, understand, the areas where you don't have limitations, and they're good to go, but just understand that this is a long path.
So, before we wrap up, a quick thank you to North Star Carbon and Impact for supporting this podcast. If you're looking for an easier, more transparent way to manage carbon and ESG data, prepare for audits, reporting, and do decarbonization plans, please visit northstarcarbon.com to learn more or request a demo. Albert, where can listeners connect with you and learn more about GSI Environmental's work?
Yeah, the audience can just Google GSI sustainability. It'll take you to our website. We try to be very active in posting blogs and articles that, really gives insight into our expertise and quite frankly, provide some nice advice on how to navigate what's going on in sustainability.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Carbon Accounting Podcast. If this episode was valuable to you, please share your biggest takeaway on LinkedIn and tag us so we can continue the conversation. Thanks for listening.